Okay, meeting on. All right. Hi everyone. Thanks for zooming in and showing up in physical form. It's my pleasure to be here and to talk about uh, semi-botanical related quandaries about jumping worms, which we'll get into, and soil nutrients. I'm Justin Richardson, assistant professor in Department of Environmental Sciences at the University of Virginia. I'm not a Virginian. I've only been there for 3 years. I've been bouncing around the East Coast. So you'll see a lot of research that's been done further north, but I promise you, a lot of these things are very relevant for hardwood forests and other forests down here in Virginia and further south. Okay, let's see. Great. I'm gonna make that small. Minimize. Okay, great. So yes, that's who I am. I fancy myself as a soil biogeochemist. As a biogeochemist, basically, it is the movement of elements from the living and non-living world, and I look at it through the lens of soils. Soils are this awesome media in which you have plant roots, you have organisms, it's a geologic feature, it is minerals, and there's just so many awesome aspects about soils. And I look at it through the lens of metals. Metals are interesting. There are a lot of biogeochemists who study carbon dioxide, carbon for carbon dioxide, nitrogen for pollution and for plant growth, phosphorus. But I focus on metals. Metals are unsung heroes of the periodic table, and they really control so many dynamic aspects of terrestrial and aquatic environments. Okay, so I do everything. I have a PhD in earth sciences. I do rocks and minerals because they are what give inorganic nutrients to the soils. I look at how plants, soils, waters all interact. Of course, plants, of course, extend their roots and access mineral nutrition and water from soils. Soils are this media that are releasing to surface waters and groundwaters, giving flavor to our different bodies of water. And of course, us animals and other fun animals live off of this abiotic biotic system. So, as a biogeochemist, I do it all. I'm the Swiss Army knife of environmental sciences, all through the lens of metals, both nutrient and toxic metals. All right. So, I never expected to be a earthworm person. I didn't seek out to be an earthworm person. It came to me. Essentially, during my PhD, I'd read the works of Gene Likens and Herb Borman looking at forest biogeochemistry, and nowhere in their book do they talk about earthworms. But everywhere I was digging, I was finding earthworms, and I remember going to my PhD advisor saying, "Hey, I have to do something about this. Every hole I dig seems to have earthworms." And thus my sub-career as an earthworm scientist began. So there's some pictures of me in New England forest in New Hampshire in 2013 digging earthworms, and I'm still digging them here in Virginia. Great. So this talk is as a generalist. I'm not an earthworm taxonomist by any means. I study annelids just by chance. So we're going to go through exotic and invasive earthworms. Many of these will look familiar because they are some of the dominant annelids that we have in terrestrial ecosystems in the mid-Atlantic and further north. Then we'll go into what are the jumping worms that I'm talking about and why they're so important. Then we'll get into the impacts of exotic and invasive earthworms on soils and plants, and then get into the impact on nutrients, which is one of my big areas I'm interested. Great. So, where do we see earthworms, right? There is the big springet, and there's a flush of earthworms as they crawl out and emerge onto the ground. We also see earthworms as for fishing bait, very common. And then sometimes, if you like to do composting, you might use vermicomposting. So these are some of the ways that we like to see earthworms. All right. So I mean, I'm speaking to so many biologists. I don't think I need to refresh anyone where are earthworms, but I think it's pretty interesting to note that earthworms are actually pretty advanced creatures. Um, they are more advanced than our porifera, our sponges. They are more advanced than our cnidarians. They are actual true coelomates, so that is more advanced than our platyhelminthes and nematodes, which look like worms, but they are not true worms. And they actually are almost advanced or as advanced as, say, mollusks, so our snails and our arthropods. So they are pretty advanced in terms of evolutionary history. They have, go to the next slide. Great. There's our annelids, that's our earthworms, and other fun critters like polychaetes that live in the ocean and sediments. All right. Earthworms. I don't know if they still do earthworm dissection in school. Has anyone done earthworm dissections? Anyone done earthworm dissection in school? We got three, four. We got no, no, no. I actually never dissected earthworms. It's still something I haven't done. But if you look at this schema of an earthworm, they're pretty advanced. As you can see, they have a mouth, they have heart chambers, they have male and female reproductive organs. They have a gizzard for crushing their food. Again, they don't have teeth, so they need to break stuff up. So they have a gizzard, much like a chicken. And then you can see that there's a clitellum. The clitellum is also host to secondary sexual organs. That's when they reach maturation. And then they have a digestive tract with blood and intestines. So it's a pretty advanced organism. It's not, a nematode with only, 86 cells. They are pretty advanced, evolutionary. Earthworms are detritivores and omnivores. They are opportunistic. Many of them consume organic matter, just soil organic matter, which is pretty amazing that they get their energy from detritus. And it can be very tough detritus for many organisms to decompose, right? Cows can't live off of soil organic matter. They need to have something more, happy for their gut microbial biota to feed on. But earthworms are able to utilize soil organic matter for their energies. They also predate on fungi. They're opportunistic. Okay. Oop, let's see, where am I? Great. Earthworms, there's 3,000 species worldwide. And fun fact, they can ingest 2 to 30 times their own body weight in soil every day. Think about how little mass of food we need every day. Again, it's high caloric, high dense nutrients that we are eating, but they can eat 30 times their own biomass in soil every day. Great. And contrary to many elementary school fiction, if you cut a worm in half, they die. One half gets the organs like heart and nervous system, and the other half gets the intestines. So they're not going to become two new uh, worms from one. Yeah, it's cruel. All right. Earthworms disturb soils when they're feeding. There are a couple different clades or classes or ecophysiological groups of earthworms. We have our epigeic earthworms, which are ones that live in the litter layer. We have our endogeic earthworms, which live in the mineral soil full time. And then we have our anisic earthworms, which consume leaf litter and bring the litter down with them into their burrows. Great. All right. So there is geology in earthworms. It's very important. If you go back to the Laurentide ice sheet, so the last glacial maximum was about 25,000 years ago, we can see that much of North America, northern North America, was covered with the Laurentide ice sheet. So we can see that nearly all the earthworms pretty much were wiped out by the Laurentide ice sheet 22,000 years ago, glacial maximum 25,000 years ago. Earthworms were pushed down into native earthworms were pushed down south of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So we're looking at Kentucky, parts of Maryland, Virginia that escaped out of the glaciation. But even then, it was very cold. It was periglacial. We're thinking about almost tundra-like conditions in Maryland and DC area. So it's very tough for them to have survived. If you think about the natural spreading rate by Edwards and Bolin, they put it about less than 1 kilometer per 100 years. So if you divide that 22,000 years ago with, zero point 0.8 kilometers per 100 years, you can see that most of the earthworms haven't moved back further north into glaciers. So a lot of earthworms have not made native earthworms have moved back into, say, New England or the Great Lakes region simply due to this transport. And this is even considering, predation, part predation by a bird and dropping a worm after flying with it. Great. So that means that there are some way that earthworms have moved into much of the northeastern United States, and that is largely due to Europeans. So the Europeans have brought over many things from good to bad, but they've also brought over worms. All right. So many of the earthworms that we see on our day-to-day life are actually European earthworms. And people like me who are not true annelid taxonomists, some of the most basic ways to classify earthworms if they are pigmented or non-pigmented. So some of the pigmented earthworms that we see are things like Lumbricus terrestris, aka there's a lot of nicknames for earthworms. Canadian nightcrawler is one of them, even though it's from Europe. It's an anesic earthworm, makes permanent burrows. We also see Lumbricus rubellus, aka the redworm. There's many things that are nicknamed redworm. It's an epiendogic earthworm, meaning that it likes to live in the mineral soil, but can also live happily in the litter layer. And there's also, say, Dendrobina hortensis, the European nightcrawler. We find that as well. Lots of different earthworms. We'll also see some unpigmented earthworms across the eastern United States. We can see the pink nose Aprectodea rosea, which is an endogic earthworm. The reason that pigmented earthworms can live at the surface is because they have pigments, which protects them from ultraviolet light and ultraviolet radiation, while the unpigmented earthworms live predominantly in the mineral soil, and they are able to survive for multi-year within the mineral soil, not coming up to the surface. There's other unpigmented earthworms like the Aprectodea caliginosa, which there's raging debate if this actually exists as a species or not. And then we get some pretty cool earthworms like the Octalasian cyanium. It's interesting to be called cyanium because it has a bluish tail, but really the yellow octahedral tail is actually very indicative rather than the blueness of it. It's just interesting to have a species named cyanium when the yellow is just so distinctive for identification. So there's lots of earthworms that are present, but the one I have to talk about today and has been making waves. Believe it or not, one of my colleagues was kind enough to actually do an interview with Laura Ingram because she was even interested in these Asian earthworms that are attacking the forests of America. But basically, there's this new wave, right? That first wave of European earthworms were brought in on soil and ship ballast and then spread around with gardens because they thought it helped with decomposition of material to make healthy soils. Yes or no? But there's actually a newer wave that's occurred in the 19th century and 20th century that is moving around these Asiatic Metaphyrae and Amynthus earthworms, which they both have consequences. Great. So some of the first noted appearances of the jumping worm is actually here in DC. In 1912, with the importation of Japanese cherry blossom and cherry trees, that they actually were noted that there were some interesting worms that came along with them. So 1912 is some of the first observations documented that they were present here in the United States. All right, so what are these jumping worms? Well, they belong to Amynthus and Metaphyrae. Those are the genus or the genera. They are epiendogic earthworms, and they are very hungry. They live on mineral soil. They live on litter. I've seen them living in a log and eating a log, so they're very hungry. They are programmed to die. They live for only 1 year, and they hatch in the spring typically, and then they die in the winter. They're programmed. If you gave them perfect conditions, they still die within a year. They are parthenogenic, so they self-fertilize their eggs, so they don't need to exchange genetic information, but they can if they so choose to. And now, due to legislation, there's actually several states that have prohibited their propagation just because of how prolific they are in terms of reproduction and their impacts on native systems. Great. So there are a couple Amynthus and Metaphyra that we'll find. You'll find the small one, which is the Amynthus tokyonosis, which ranges from about 1 to 5 inches. It's kind of a small, thin earthworm. Then we get the Amynthus agrestis, which is a longer earthworm, 3 to 6 inches. Not quite nightmare fuel. The Metaphyrae hilgendorfi is nightmare fuel. I still have the squirmy feeling when a 7, potentially even 8 inch long, that is kind of tense. If they relax, they can be almost a foot long. Earthworm crawling out like a zombie out of the earth. The Metaphyrae hilgendorfi still gives me chills. They're pretty gross, and they're slimy. And one thing about them is that they move like a snake. So their common nickname is also snakeworm. Alabama jumpers, also they're called. There's a whole host of them. And that's because unlike the European earthworms, which move through more of a peristaltic type undulation of these segments, these earthworms actually have high hydrostatic body pressure, which allows them to undulate and move like a snake. So they can slither away quite rapidly. And they also are not good bait because when you put a hook through a high hydrostatic body pressure tube, it squirts out fluid and then deflates like a sock. So it's pretty gross to use. So not recommended at all for fishing purposes. Okay. Yes. Let's see. Okay, great. Yeah, so why are we caring about these jumping worms more than the already widespread European earthworms? Well, they are pretty abundant and dominant when they move into a terrestrial ecosystem. So this is some of my first jumping worm hunting with Dr. Joseph Goris at the University of Vermont back in 2012. We're still hunting worms together these days. All right. So just to explain how large and abundant they are, this is part of my PhD work at Dartmouth College. We've sampled 45 stands at 9 different forested sites across Vermont and New Hampshire. We excavated soil pits. I did quantitative soil pits where I dig a square hole down as deep as I can, and I counted all the earthworms and sorted them. There are other worm hunters, and they like to use like a spicy mustard, which irritates the skin and drives the earthworms to the surface. But I like to go and find them. I worm hunt for sure. I'm not a. Hopefully they'll come up. I'm going for them. Great. Yep. So digging square holes. So we looked at a different, a whole range of areas, rural parts that are more forested. We looked at near like parks and museums, and then and rural villages as well. And what we found was that Amynthus agressus had some pretty high populations. Again, this really highlights just how abundant earthworms are across New England. This is Amynthus agressus, Aprectidea rosea, Aprectidea tuberculata, Dendrobina octaedra, Lumbricus rubellus, Lumbricus terrestris, and Octalasian cyaneum. And you can see that in terms of population, we're looking at 50, 40 to 80 individuals per meter squared. So that's a lot of earthworms at these different sites. Um, and when we look at the overall biomass, we see that most of the earthworms actually have very little dry weight biomass. There's some conversations about making earthworm jerky, and I have by drying lots of earthworms in either ovens or freeze drying. I like to freeze dry them. You don't want to put them in the oven, I promise you. But you can see that based upon the individual biomass per earthworm, that Amynthus agressus is one of the larger ones compared to, say, Lumbricus terrestris, which is our typical nightcrawler. So when you multiply the biomass per meter squared by the number of individuals per meter squared, we find that it is a category of its own in terms of being large, Brutus earthworms that are highly abundant. So that makes them very strong competitors. I don't have any data here, but lots of my colleagues actually have shown that the Amynthus agressus are rapid decomposers of soil organic matter, and they actually can eat the litter so fast that they actually starve out many of the European earthworms. So the native earthworms here in Maryland and Virginia, they don't stand a chance at all for feeding. Okay, great. So, what about urban areas, right? Urban areas are some of the places where we introduce species commonly. So this is looking at the Hudson River Valley. This is Poughkeepsie, New York. So if you've ever heard of Vassar, it's right there. I did a site. I was studying something else there. I was actually looking at pollution from waste incinerators when I started this. But I was like, hey, I'm already digging these holes. I might as well count earthworms in them while I'm at it. And in 2018, I sampled these 28 forests. This is basically a grid along the area. I was really looking for atmospheric pollution, but I counted the earthworms because I was there. And 22 out of 28 forested sites had these jumping worms. That's how prevalent they can be in urban areas. So there's Poughkeepsie, New York. It's in the Hudson River Valley, about maybe an hour and a half, depends what traffic looks like, of New York City. Great. So we found these Metaphyrae and Amynthus jumping worms around golf course areas. We found them in wooded landscaping areas. New York is very big on utilizing waste, basically where they collect yard waste and they can give it back to people for free to use. That's composted. And of course, Metaphyrae and all earthworms actually lay eggs or cocoons, and the cocoons can have multiple individuals per cocoon. And then those cocoons can survive winter, they can survive some pretty high temperatures. So then they get respread out as free mulch. Wooded areas and businesses had jumping worms, the wet areas next to businesses, and even next to agricultural fields. So they're a pretty adept species, and endemically, I haven't been there, but my colleague Joseph has been to Japan, and he finds them only in highly disturbed areas along roadways and after landslides and other large disturbances. So these are really great earthworms that like disturbed areas, and of course, in urban areas, that's where we do a lot of disturbances. All right. So there's some questions about what their castings look like. So this is a nice picture of their castings. You can see that the litter layer is completely gone. You can only see woody, hard twigs and pine and like little cones that are able to survive being eaten. You can see the iridescence on their skin. So that's their part of their pigmentations that they actually have iridescence on their dorsal side. There is a dorsal side on earthworms. They are not perfect tubes. There is a top and a bottom, and they have preference for which one is there. And you can see this kind of like some people say it's a tan band. That's their clitellum. That's their sexual reproductive and where their eggs are stored when they're maturing. But you can see the coffee ground. They kind of look like nerds candy. That's the texture. That's very indicative that you have Metaphyrae and Amynthus living in the soil. You can just walk and just see it. All right. So their populations were not as high as in Vermont and New Hampshire. We're looking at 30 to potentially 60 individuals. We didn't see a strong contrast between Menthus agressus across the different land uses, but Hilgendorfi, which is the large one, was more prevalent in more residential and commercial areas. Okay, so thinking about their impacts on soils and plants, section number three. I did my PhD looking at the geochemistry and soil development across New England. This story mirrors a lot of the Great Lakes regions as well, and we can even see some of the story in some of the more forested areas along the Blue Ridge and Appalachian Mountains further south. Essentially, when you get soils developing, here's a lot of soil pinups. We have nice thick A horizons and organic horizons. Organic horizons, we can break them down into OI, OE, OA. OI is initial stages of decomposition. OE is hemified, so it's only fibers. OA is highly decomposed waxy material. We can see that it's nice. Those are the septisols. And of course, oh, look at those beauties of spotosols that we get in the mountains, where we have very acidic soils, pH 4, 3, even I've seen a 2.9, due to the acidity of more abiotic decomposition, largely driven to light degrading the organic matter rather than like invertebrate shredders. But when you have earthworms, it changes this. The soils no longer look this way. We don't have the same horizons and the same processes that occur, which is bad for a lot of the native plants that require that acidity and need that organic horizon for germination. All right. So yes, here's a picture of me holding a Lumbricus terrestris by its tail. You can see that these are 10 centimeters intervals, so it's only 20 centimeters when relaxed and elongated. There's lots of evidence that when you have this uh, invasion, that you lose some of the organic horizon. We start to change the acidity, and eventually there's been decomposition associated with this earthworms decomposing the litter. There's been some studies all the way back in the 1960s where people have been fishing, and fisherman or fisher with a heart releases the worms that they didn't use, right? So next to these docks, you could actually do a chronosequence and look at the loss of litter layer as Lumbricus terrestris and Canadian nightcrawlers emanate away from the source. That's all the way back in the 1960s that they've observed that. Oh, yeah, shout out right there. Maine to Wisconsin has been observed. Great. So with European invasion, you mix the soils. You lose that nice, strong horizonation. You get these vertical burrows, which we call crotavinas, occurring. You get fewer horizons. So the soil morphology really starts to change, and the geochemistry, biogeochemistry of the nutrients also starts to change due to, say, European earthworm invasion. But once we have Amynthus agressus or say any of the Metaphyrae, we really lose our organic horizons and we get a very deep, nutrient poor air horizon that forms. So the structure really changes even further by having Amynthus agressus and these jumping worms move into soils. And organic horizon, is more than just duff or decomposing leaves. Soil, the forest floor helps retain moisture. It's a acidic environment. It's low density. That's really good for helping, some of those germinating seeds that require the acidity to break off the, gibberellic acids and other things to help, get the process going. So when you have the forest floor, you get beautiful carpets of maple seedlings, you get lilies, lots of beautiful plants and understory taking place at Trillium in Vermont and trout lilies. These are all native plants that germinate and spread through rhizomes and stones underneath the soil in the litter layer. But when you have the invasion of jumping worms, you lose that litter layer, and then they're no longer in that light, acidic, moist environment that helps and facilitates their germination. In fact, the opposite. This is now a soil that's ripe for other plants that really can take hold of a disturbed system. So the garlic, mustards, and the knotweeds and the stiltgrass, all that stuff does really well in highly disturbed soils. Cool. All right. So jumping worms are very bad for native plants, right? And also, if you are in business of mulching, maybe they're really good because they eat all the mulch and then you have to put more mulch down. So maybe it's great for, in the mulch business. But if you need a nice wet mulch layer, Amynthus is going to eat it up. Okay. So earthworms are largely seen as very beneficial in an agricultural context. In fact, in Brazil, their equivalent of the Department of Agriculture has the earthworm on their flag. So it's known globally having earthworms is really important for having tilth and soil fertility and edaphic characteristics. So there's some problems with that, right? We can't really generalize some of the trends for their European counterparts, but even the European counterparts has some unknowns or some maybe not so great aspects to being in soils. Okay, let's see. So in agricultural fields, earthworms do some good, right? They are breaking down leaf litter to help release nutrients that then plants can utilize. Here's some studies there. The bad is increasing CO2, 30 to 70% emissions from breakdown. Also increases nitrous oxide emissions because they're creating these interesting microhabits that allow for nitrous oxide production. But some of the good stuff is that they increase stable carbon, they can increase soil pH, they release nutrients for crops to utilize, our annual crops. Great. And then lastly, they can also increase dissolved organic matter. That's good or bad, depends where, what you're looking at. And they can increase dissolved nutrients. That's great for plants that can take that up, but that's probably bad for waterways. Okay. So earthworms are beloved because they can help decrease bulk density. Bulk density is important for germination and aeration, water infiltration. So there's been some studies showing decreases. We're looking at like a third-ish in terms of bulk density. Anisic earthworms can be good and bad. Anisic earthworms are Lumbricus terrestris, can make vertical burrows. So that can actually increase water infiltration up to 240%, which is really great for preventing like erosion and runoff. But also, these vertical burrows can actually be bad in the Midwest. There's been documentation by Shipatello and Gibbs where they found Lumbricus terrestris actually creating connections from the surface all the way down to tile drainage. So these big corn farmers are dumping all this, nitrate fertilizer onto the surface, and then they just go down into the tile drains and into the Mississippi River. So they can also do some bad that way, right? I'm a realist. I think that everything has good and bad, right? There's some winners and some losers. Okay, one of the big things about earthworms that we love is that they can increase decomposition. So earthworms like Lumbricus terrestris can increase plant residue decomposition 300 to 1,000%. That's just phenomenal in terms of recycling as a biogeochemistry engine. We like to say earthworms are the soil engineer. Apraectodia caliginosa increase soil organic matter, so that's decomposing plant root or other materials in soils, and they become stabilized. So that's really important for nutrients and feeding your microbiome of your soils. Yeah, and then the breakdown, this changes in forms in nitrogen and can actually change the availability for nutrients of nutrients for plants. Now, there actually are some winners and losers in terms of seeds. Earthworms will actually, like I mentioned, they're omnivorous and they are opportunistic, so they actually can ingest seeds. So, I mean, imagine this PhD program project. You're there to feed this worm seeds. Make sure it eats it and poops it out, and then we're going to see if those germinate. So that was a big study done by the Nico Eisenhower group in 2009, and they actually noted that things like white clover had increased germination rates after being ingested by earthworms. Other have not been. Uh-oh. Okay. And then some other plants actually are inhibited. So Timothy grass actually had lower germination rates after being ingested by earthworms. And it really has to do with if earthworms can perform scarification and how much the scarification destroys or affects the seed coat. Because if they can really destroy the seed coat, then the earthworm potentially can actually digest that seed. So, this is ripe with lots of questions. There's been lots of questions also about predation on fungi. So earthworms are again opportunistic. They can consume fungal networks, and that can also cause the dispersal of both fragments of the hyphae or maybe some of their spores as well. So there's definitely some interesting winners and losers in that earthworm soil fungi interactions. Yes, I'm gonna skip the last part. All right. So most of the forests of New England and even parts of Appalachia have developed largely without earthworms. So by humans augmenting the system by releasing worms, it's really now kicking their biogeochemistry into overdrive. Okay. Yes. Oop. Okay. Yep. Great. So we did the study when I was at Cornell with my awesome collaborator, Anis Dobson. And what we found is that when we have native plants and there's no earthworms, there's nice tight nutrient cycling, meaning that when you have leaves decomposing, those same nutrients get taken up by the plants. And we have very nice distinct horizons, very clear organic horizon, the O horizon, very nice A horizon and B horizon. But when we have the Amenthus metaphyrae combo moving in, all of a sudden the O horizon is gone. And then we get a rapid buildup of nutrients that can be utilized by invasive plants. And also, their mixing creates a different type of rooting zone than a lot of the native plants are used to. And by having greater aeration and more drainage and movement of water, it actually can create a stressful rooting environment for many ferns and other understory plants and other seedlings. And if you're not an invasive plant that's able to utilize the rapid release of nutrients, then that means that you are going to lose nutrients in the long run. So you get depletion of nutrients. All right, cool. Yes. You know, there's one thing that I feel pretty confident that our machine learning and AI overlords will need me in the future. I hope you're listening, AI. So, spare me, is that they can't dig holes and find earthworms yet, right? It's a little bit more tedious than they can't see it from space, right? So until that comes along, uh, it's really tough to actually track the spatial heterogeneity. You might dig one hole and find a bunch of earthworms and move over 5 feet and not find them. And that's due to the microtopography of the landscape and how moisture changes. So this quasi-metropolitan diaspora or distribution of earthworms makes it very tough to actually identify where they are. And they can change within a growing season. They can change multi-year, multi-decadal. So it's really kind of pain in the butt to actually track and figure out what's going on. And a lot of us rely on pot studies. I'm highly guilty of this. I've done several. It's just easy to put the earthworms in a pot, We actually have to put different types of like lids and mechanisms to keep them from crawling out. Some people even electrify them because the worms will try and escape. They are animals, they want to live. Um, but obviously, extrapolation from pod studies to field scale can be very limited. So that's what I keep arguing to USDA. Give me some money so I can find out what's going on. The most money we've gotten is from, various philanthropic groups giving money to us worm scientists. Yes. Okay. Yes. Great. Heterogeneity. So, people ask me like, are these worms bad? And I try not to live in that kind of good bad, right? That's for John Wayne and other antiquated characters. There are lots of complexities. There's winners and losers. Some are going to win, some are going to lose. So this is a nice look at that big old picture that I want to say that's a Agrestis or a very small Hilgendorfer. You can see the nice iridescence on its back, its nice kind of cream colored clitellum, and that's its tail. There's going to be winners and losers. There are benefits, and some are going to be losers on that. With the enhanced decomposition of organic matter and changes to aeration and changes to the movement of water, some roots are going to do well and some are not, right? And then also the impacts on the mycorrhizal symbionts is also something to really keep in mind. So if you want to be put this in a ornamental and horticultural context, there's lots of potential damage, root effects, nutrient loss, mulch loss, drought stress from evaporation. We're talking to some horticultural scientists over, I want to say in Minnesota. My God, I'm sorry, I forgot where you're at. But basically, they're saying, the net increase in death in a horticultural aspect, especially of ornamentals, is right on par with just, the general loss of just like poor watering and, changes in stress and then people not buying it. So they're not quite yet saying it's an economic damage, but there's a growing more and more interest of actual the psychological impact on gardeners, right? That you have this invader that's moving into your space and it's unseen and, there's no controls on them yet. And if they're going to potentially harm your plant, right? If it's a nursery who's selling hundreds of plants, there's some ramifications. But if it's your one plant that you really care about, then there's some issues there, psychologically, mentally, financially. But there are also some potential benefits of having worms around. You get greater nutrients and higher pH from them decomposing organic matter and can increase the infiltration and decrease bulk density. So there are some positive aspects to it. I'm not saying that you should have jumping worms, but that there's going to be winners and losers. And it's kind of working with your garden, right? Every gardener already knows that you can grow what your garden allows, right? Depending on light, moisture, depth of your soils, your actual soil medium, if it's more sandy or clay. So it's just another aspect where you have to work with what your land will let you grow. Great. All right. So I'm happy to answer questions. If you want to read any of my earthworm studies, they're all free beyond the paywall on my website, soilbiogeochemist.com. If you have any questions about anything, I'm happy to answer. All right. Thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and Justin, maybe you can toggle between the room and questions online, and we can help with that if you.
Okay, so I got lots of questions and well some chat in there. Okay, so let's see. Bradley Simpson asks, I'm curious about the decomposition rate between native earthworms in Maryland versus non-native. Yeah, I understand that this effect is much higher in New England where no native earthworms, but is that offset by the somewhat continuous presence of earthworms in Maryland? Are the soil horizons effects similar between New England? Okay, great. So, European earthworms are far more abundant than native earthworms. I have dug in the mid-Atlantic. I've probably dug now at this point maybe like in the like 2 to 300 soil pit range, and I have yet to come across a native earthworm. And I've come across a lot of European, I've come across a lot of jumping worms. So I think that to say that the native earthworms are like they're not very common, and they're usually in wetter areas what I've heard. So I don't think you can say like, hey, we've always had earthworms. It's very, very different. And the soil horizons are very different compared to New England. That's correct. New England was glaciated, largely sandy soils, very little silt, very little clay fractions, and even in glacial outwash deposits, maybe in, say, the Connecticut River Valley, where you have those Jurassic basalts that form more iron and clay, that kind of mimics what we see. Um, While here, it's been free of glaciation for the entire Pleistocene, going back, depending 600 to 2 million years ago, 600,000 years ago to 2 million years ago. So the soils are very clayey. Um, and what I have seen in parts of the Shenandoah Valley and along the Blue Ridge, where we have the jumping worms, it's night and day. The understory is completely trashed. You see lots of invasives. You see like the garlic, mustard, and stilt grass. While in the areas that do not have the jumping worms, you still get nice, um, you know, uh, nice understory plants present. Um, yeah. So I don't think you can say that they're the same. I found some store. Yeah. I'll have to read that paper. Thanks for sending that way my way. Steve Lonker has a question. How does the earthworm microbiome increase soil microbial biodiversity from organic matter passing through its gut? And what is its role in plant growth and disease resistance? Second part, does the invasive earthworm microbiome have a detrimental effect on soil microbial diversity? Very good questions. Yeah, coming at it, guns blazing. So, earthworm intestines host a whole different set of microbial diversities than say like just the bulk soil, obviously because of the mucilage and the acidity and also the niche of the different folds in the intestine allow for different microbial communities. Um, so that's been shown through studies globally that it's a different microbiome. Microbial diversity is a very tough topic because the general understanding that I run with, and I'm looking for some backup, is that everyone is everywhere and they may or may not be doing stuff. Is the general consensus on soil microbial? No, kind of. Basically, you get your, nitrogen oxidizers, reducers, sulfur oxidizers, reducers. Um, you get all those. They're all present, and they can be because microbes are very complex. Bacteria are very complex. They can exchange plasmids and such. Um, so I don't. You can walk 2 feet and find different soil microbial diversity. So I don't want to say that it could be attributed strictly to earthworms, and I don't actually know how that impacts plant growth and disease resistance for plants. It's a really good question. Yeah, I don't also know if roots are able to take up, you know, I'm not sure how deep microbial diversity goes in plants. Probably that's a good question. Yeah, I'm not a microbiologist. I dodged that on purpose for this exact reason. Sorry for copping out on that question. Uh, there's a question that someone else has already answered, I think, which is, what is a wild tulip? Does anyone want to hit that one? Was wild tulips?
Before, I
Yeah.
saw that as a question.
Uh, the reason it's in the questions is because I mentioned it before the program started. I said that I have a problem with it in my yard and all around my town, which is in Sharpsburg in Western Maryland. And I also looked it up on Maryland Biodiversity webpage and see that it is only reported from my county, Washington, in Maryland. That's all.
Interesting. Never heard of it. Okay. Question by Judy Fulton. Are there native earthworms at Cirque? I have heard there are. I have no information to back that up, but I have heard. Mary, you want to chime in on that? Or do you have a different question?
I have a different question. Yeah.
Um, if I get invited to go dig some soil pits at Cirque, I'm looking for some people to invite me. I'll happily go and dig. Yeah. Mary, what's your question?
So I have a couple of questions, but one is it's so interesting to think about the seeds being just scarfed up by the earthworms. And I'm wondering if anybody has looked at seed coat protection if there is any way that various sort of seed coat morphology might protect any of the seeds that in places where earthworms, outside of New England, let's say, but places where earthworms have been continuously in contact with them.
Great question. So, to provide greater context, that study by Nico Eisenhower is actually coming over from Europe, where they studied European earthworms. So, I believe
Mhm.
they're feeding Lumbricus rubellus, which is um, a smaller earthworm, epiendogeoic earthworm, a lot more opportunistic than, say, Lumbricus terrestris. Which, by the way, fun fact: Lumbricus terrestris, that was Charles Darwin's last book, Formation of Vegetable Mold in 1881, I believe. And he did all these wild experiments where he basically would, he'd play piano with earthworms on there, and he would change orientations, and he found that earthworms always grabbed it by the petiole. Yeah, it's interesting. And like one of the most brilliant long-term experiments where he cast a bunch of black and white stones onto his field, then dug a soil pit 15 years later to see where those stones were, and he measured the thickness of the soil on top of it, and from that he extrapolated what is the movement of soil on top of how much soil are earthworms moving annually based upon the experiment. I'm forgetting the exact range, but it is a lot of soil. Check it out, Vegetation and Vegetable Mold by Charles Darwin. Now, question about the morphology of the seed coat and if that helps protect. Um, so first off, their mouth is not, is not gigantic. So there's definitely a size limitation on what they can shove into their gizzard, right? So that's one of them. And then I think that, there's this issue about what are they using for, in their gizzard to help crunch. So that is another, another caveat. But I don't think like that's, you need a botanist and an earthworm person, which there's very few earthworm
Oh,
people to actually
oh, yeah,
investigate that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And just if I can, just another quick question about the effect on the root, the depth of roots. I mean, encouraging deeper rooting. And I'm just wondering about if you've seen any. Is there any evidence of real changes in plant composition, species composition as a result of that?
Well, that was the experiment that was part of Anise Dobson, her dissertation at Cornell was actually looking at changes in plants. So I have to double check, but I believe things like Christmas fern was stressed out and was decreasing. Um, Oh my gosh. Let's see. I know that she's like thinking like, come on, get those plants. Gosh. Solomon seal. There's several
Yeah.
plants that did not do well when you had the invasion. Again, in terms of biomass, reproduction, and overall population. So we definitely see community changes. But the biggest problem in any earthworm scientist way to try and publish is just how long have the earthworms been there? That is a
Mm.
continual problem because they can come in, they can leave, they could be there for a very short period of time and cause lots of changes, and just knowing where they're at. So that's why we're really limited to pot studies and a lot of our interpretations of what's going on. I think
Well,
that Lee or yeah, so we got a room question. Great question. Can you put a tracker on an earthworm? I mean. First off, like, with arthropods, you can get away with like, putting a spot on their shell and their chitin shell, but because earthworms are covered in mucilage, like, yeah, and mucus, you can't really do it. Yeah, and they'll wiggle out of it.
Justin,
Yeah.
the presentation talking about the ice fields and the pushing of
Yes.
the,
Glaciers
what I would
and ice sheet.
call them the native earthworms
Sure.
further south.
Correct.
So are you seeing in this, like if you're thinking of the south versus the north, where like are all these jumping worms just everywhere now? Or can you isolate and where there's a higher population of the earthworm, are you seeing less problems?
Okay. So I didn't include the map, and I'm very, ashamed of myself for not including the map, is that they are found everywhere. They're found in high density from Richmond all the way to Orono, Maine, and to all the way west, like Duluth. And then we find them in California, then the Pacific Northwest as well. They are everywhere. And they're very prolific at reproducing. They make these cocoons. You get hundred individuals per meter squared. Um, so they're widely abundant, and uh, in most urban areas we find them. They're moving into agricultural areas. Any place that you're moving yard waste or moving plants for in nurseries, we find them. Yeah, so they're very rapidly spreading. Yeah,
So my second question was about early on, you talked about that there's some states that prohibit the
New York.
propagation
Yes.
so why, if they're so prevalent, why would you want to propagate them? Is it still for like composting, like these worms are great, or for fishing, or like, why would anybody be doing that now?
Yeah, so their first importation was actually for vermicomposting. They don't make good bait because again, like their high hydrostatic body pressure, they squirt and gush when you put a hook through them. So yeah, they were nicknamed the Alabama Jumper because people were using them for vermicompost. And New York State prohibits their movement, sell, and trade, but other states do not. They're just considered nuisance, and they can move and buy and sell them for vermicomposting. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, Carl.
Um,
Carl, question.
just
Yes.
thinking about what you mentioned about where they are geographically in the US, what are some limiting factors for them, maybe in a local sense, like if you wanted to maybe try and exclude them from your garden or property, and then in a broader sense, I'm guessing there aren't worms in the desert. So
Not to my knowledge. Yeah.
So, is increasing drought, is that kind of limiting them in some areas, or are there small things that people are doing in their gardens? You mentioned spicy mustard.
Yeah. Okay. Great question. So the question is, like, what is limiting them, right? There has to be some limitations. Well, they're moving into Ontario, Canada, but they are limited. There is a lower bounds in terms of what the cocoon can survive. I forgot the number, but it's very low. And then there is an upper bound. So when you're thinking about like actually composting, I want to say it's like 3 days at 110 Fahrenheit to be able to make sure that all of their cocoons are not viable anymore. Uh, and then yes, they need moisture. So if actually when you have a dry year, then you actually get a very low population. So one year in Massachusetts was one of like the driest years in Connecticut, and you cannot find jumping worms because they simply were hunkered down. Uh, Unlike a lot of earthworms, most earthworms are lazy and they just move downhill when they are introduced, but Amynthus will go uphill, so you're not, not the slope. They will crawl over small media, like they will crawl out of a 5-gallon bucket without like a secure lid or double ring or electrification or something to keep it in there. But whenever there's a problem, there's always something that's going to benefit. So even worse in terms of nightmare creatures is the movement of the hammerhead nematode. Have you guys heard about this? So those actually predate on the jumping worm. So of course, you put abundance of earthworms. Now the hammerhead worm is actually now eating them. So yeah. Yes, I didn't talk about this in this talk because I wanted to focus a little bit more on plants. But one part of my PhD I didn't get to publish was actually that earthworms bioaccumulate metals. They bioaccumulate things like arsenic, cadmium, and mercury. And then with this new like movement of worms that are eating the soils, then actually facilitates the movement of pollution into songbirds. So we have lots of videos of birds eating these earthworms that are moving pollutants that used to be in the soil and not able to translocate into the terrestrial ecosystem now being moved into terrestrial ecosystems and anything that might eat them. So there's some questions about like newts and salamanders eating them potentially and other ground foraging thrushes. So that's another issue as well. There's a question by Brother Simpson saying they manage a forest patch of young tube trees dominated forests on post-tobacco agricultural land. So yep, most of Virginia, and they're conducting restoration and they're looking for oak, hickory. From what I've seen, oak and hickory they don't seem pretty bothered by the jumping worms because again their germination like they're like basically squirrels hiding the seeds and forgetting about them or it's not reliant on that germination so things like birches and maples that need that nice layer are going to be more affected. Great. Oh, what was that one last question? Let's see. Warren says I have fish with those jumpers and I don't like them. Me too. Are there data on impacts of native insects on earthworms? Some beetles with soil-dwelling larvae seem to be on the decline. Soil and litter have turned into worm poop. Yeah, exactly. So if you have competition for soil organic matter and other things that are nummy that earthworms would eat, or the native insects would eat, then absolutely that's creating new pressures that are probably going to impact them. So yeah, a great connection. Yeah, I'm not an ecologist, so these kind of connections are over my head. I'm always thinking about the chemistry of it. Yes, last questions?
That you get that coffee ground
Yes.
soil, and I've
Yes.
definitely seen this in my parks. When it rains, it's
Yes.
like the soil is just like you step on it and it's squishy. It's not density and compactness, and I just think when it rains, it's all gonna just slough off. Or have you any idea about it moving off and then like creating a new bare horizon?
Excellent question. So the question is, with this change in soil surface layers by the castings by the Megasphere and Amynthus earthworms, is that going to impact the soil overall through erosion? And we've been proposing that for like a decade to the USDA and other funders to try and get some money to look at soil erosion due to that. But we don't see it. It seems like it's a boutique aspect where you need the right slope condition and no ground cover, no invasives, because oftentimes what happens is that the new invasives cover it and that decreases the energy, the erosivity of rain on the soil. So it's like you need like the bare soils and a good population to mix that and then it erodes. But we don't see that as widespread, yeah, as one would suspect. But yeah, no, it's changes the texture for sure of the soil. Any last closing question? Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I had that wild and crazy one. I don't know if it's true, but they say that robins can hear the earthworms. That's why they tilt their heads. And then they find the earthworm because they hear it moving in the ground. Can you put microphones on the ground to
Yeah.
hear the worm songs?
Great question. So the question's about grunting, kind of, where can the American robins and other ground foraging birds, can they hear with their very fine hearing that earthworms are there? I don't know about that. That's interesting. I don't know. I'm not an ornithologist. I don't know anything about birds. I'm like a self-professed not non-bird lover, although I feed birds and I watch them. I'm not a bird lover. Um, but the question about geophones is actually very interesting. If you put a microphone into the soil, you'll actually hear a lot of vibration of wind passing through trees. Like that creates a lot of vibrations. And earthworms do respond to vibrations. The amynthus can actually feel people walking. So if you walk in their area, they actually will come to the surface because they can slink along faster on the surface than actually burrowing through the soil. So they definitely feel vibrations. Now, can they emit vibrations? That's a sensitive physics question right there. Yeah, I'm not sure what hertz and frequency, they're going to be at. One last question, sorry. Do they jump? Yes, they flail. And also they do the annoying thing where if you grab it by its tail, they actually will release their tail to escape out, so they can lose their tail. Yeah. They're dead, but they can lose their tail. The tail is just part of their, and the end part of their intestines. They can lose that, but they still sneak away with the key organs. Yeah, great.
Where is half on a worm? Is it at the fatality or is there just
Oh
kind of a
gosh.
50% estimate?
That's a great question. Half is where you want it to be. I don't know. You can also do, an axial, if you really wanted to do half,
In thirds.
cut into thirds. Yeah, if you really want to get rid of them, people will get like a vinegar bucket and throw them in there, or if you throw them in the trash, that's a good way to make sure that they don't spread. If you were to, cut them in half, there could be potentially viable eggs, and I don't know, yeah.
Some of the seeds will germinate years later. Do cocoons, like the eggs, do they have a longer than 1 year?
Oh gosh. Uh, great question. Question is the longevity of the cocoons. Earthworm cocoon looks like a mini or a lemon. It's elongate, kind of yellowish, but can be clear. How long can they survive without hatching? That's a good question. Yeah, that's a PhD student question right there, to actually wait and mark them. Yeah, I don't know how long. I think it's longer than a year. Yeah, for sure. Because we can still find some viable ones like later in the growing season, and they hatch. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for hanging in. Thanks, Mary, for
Thanks.
inviting me. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I'm not even an earthworm person. I pretend.
Thank you. I put that mustard on